Would you believe that a single dog with no training, no special commands, could save a child in a way no human could? That a dog's silent loyalty could be the only thing keeping a tiny life from disappearing forever? That a heartbeat of hope could live in 4 legs when the rest of the world didn't even know something was wrong? Well, this story begins on a quiet Sunday morning in a small rural town where time felt slower, where neighbors still waved to each other from porches, and the woods that surrounded the homes were dense, deep, and beautiful, but carried a quiet danger if you wandered too far. It was the kind of place where families felt safe, where doors were left unlocked and children played barefoot in the grass, where birds chirped in the morning air and the smell of pine trees mixed with the faint scent of warm bread coming from kitchen windows. And in one modest white house on the edge of those woods lived little Clara, a 2.5-year-old toddler with soft blonde curls and bright, curious eyes that never stopped moving. She was the kind of child who laughed with her whole body, who reached for butterflies and squealed when the wind made the chimes dance. And right beside her, always watching, always quiet, but always present, was Milo, a 5-year-old golden retriever with fur like sunlight and eyes that held a wisdom far beyond his years. Milo was not just a family pet. He was Clara's shadow, her patient playmate, her silent protector. He followed her from room to room, curled up beside her crib during naps, and rested his head on her tiny lap whenever she felt sad. Her parents, Sarah and Mark, adored Milo, but sometimes underestimated just how deeply he paid attention to every detail, every sound, every change in the air. It was a Sunday like any other. The sun shining through the curtains as Sarah prepared breakfast while Mark scrolled through his phone. Clara sat on the floor giggling as she tried to stack wooden blocks. Milo stretched lazily beside her, but his eyes never left her. Sarah stepped away for just a moment to check the laundry. Mark thought Clara was still sitting quietly by her toys. And in those few unnoticed moments, the door that led to the backyard was left slightly open, just enough for a curious toddler to push it wide and step outside into the inviting spring air. Clara, fascinated by a fluttering butterfly just beyond the porch, toddled toward it, laughing softly. The butterfly floated further into the yard, toward the tall grass, and Clara followed, her little feet carrying her further and further, without any thought of where she was going. Milo's ears perked up immediately. He noticed the shift, the absence of her soft babbling inside. He stood up quickly, trotting toward the open door. And when he saw her tiny form disappearing toward the woods, his instincts flared. He barked once, sharp but not frantic. But inside the house, the sound blended with the hum of the washing machine. No one noticed. Clara kept walking, now reaching the edge of the woods where the sunlight turned into a cool green shadow. The trees stood tall, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. And the butterfly vanished into the canopy, leaving Clara suddenly alone, unsure, but still drawn by the colors and the shapes around her. Milo followed swiftly, his paws silent on the grass, and when Clara stepped past the first tree, deeper than she should have, Milo quickened his pace. Positioning himself just behind her, Clara didn't seem afraid yet. She turned to him with a small smile as if to say, "Come with me." And he, loyal, without question, followed. The woods here were deceptively calm, the kind of calm that made you forget how easy it was to lose your way. As Clara wandered further, chasing a bird now, the sounds of home faded. The voices of her parents faded. The backyard fence was no longer in sight. And yet Milo stayed close, keeping a careful distance so he wouldn't bump her, occasionally nudging her shoulder gently when she stumbled. Back in the house, Sarah returned to the living room and froze, her heart skipping when she saw the toys empty, the door slightly open. She called out softly, "Clara," but there was no answer. Her voice grew sharper. "Clara." She rushed outside, scanning the yard, panic rising. Mark joined her, his face pale as realization hit, and in that instant the world collapsed into fear. They ran across the yard, calling her name, voices breaking with dread, but the woods, the vast woods, swallowed every sound. Clara, unaware of the panic she had left behind, now stood in a small clearing where wildflowers bloomed. She bent down to touch them, giggling softly, but the trees around her seemed taller, shadows longer, the air cooler. She took a step and her tiny foot sank into soft earth, causing her to stumble. She whimpered softly, unsure now. Milo moved closer, licking her cheek gently as if to reassure her, but he also looked around, ears twitching. He could sense the shift the deeper they went. The less familiar it became, the woods here smelled different, heavier, and Milo knew they were too far. He nudged Clara gently, trying to turn her back, but she only looked confused. She didn't know which way was home anymore. Minutes passed, then longer, and Clara began to feel tired. Her tiny legs wobbled. She sat down on a patch of moss and started to cry softly. Milo pressed his body close to hers, warm, steady, unshaken. He didn't bark yet. Not loudly, he simply stayed, shielding her with his body as the air grew cooler back at the house. Neighbors were gathering now. Mark was on the phone with the sheriff's department, his voice breaking. Sarah's hands trembled as she explained to a neighbor what had happened. The community sprang into action, search parties forming, flashlights and calls echoing into the woods. But those first moments of a search are the longest, the most painful, because every second feels like an hour, and out there, deeper in the woods than anyone realized. Clara's small sobs quieted as exhaustion settled in. She curled into Milo's side, holding onto his fur like a lifeline. And Milo didn't move. He stayed upright, alert, his eyes scanning every sound, every rustle of leaves, because he knew he couldn't let her sleep alone in that cold clearing. Even as the sky dimmed, he remained her guard, her comfort. The only familiar thing in a world suddenly too big and too strange. The searchers moved with urgency, their voices calling louder now, dogs barking in the distance. But none of them were close enough yet, and Clara, barely awake now, murmured softly into Milo's ear as if she trusted that he would take her home. And Milo, without words, simply understood. He pressed his head gently against hers and waited, knowing he would never, ever leave her side. The woods grew darker as the sun slipped behind the hills. The light that filtered through the branches turned soft and golden for just a moment before fading into the kind of dimness that makes even familiar places feel strange. Clara sat curled against Milo, her little hands gripping his soft fur as if it were the only safe thing she knew. Her breaths were uneven, hiccuping from the remnants of her tiny cries. But she didn't scream anymore. She was too tired, too confused, too small to know what to do, and Milo, loyal and silent, simply stayed close, his body warm and still. But his ears alert to every sound in the distance. He could hear faint echoes, voices calling far away. The crunch of leaves under the shoes of the searchers, but they were nowhere near yet. He looked toward the sound for a moment, then turned back to Clara, because he couldn't leave her, not even for a second, back at the house. Sarah clung to Mark's arm, her face pale with panic. As neighbors fanned out with flashlights and the local sheriff's deputies arrived with trained search dogs, volunteers moved quickly, calling Clara's name over and over. The sound of her name carried through the trees, mixing with the rustle of leaves, but it didn't reach Clara. She was too deep now. Milo listened. Tilting his head slightly, he knew those voices meant help, but Clara was getting colder. He pressed closer to her, gently licking her cheek when she whimpered. Trying to keep her awake, the air around them was cooling fast, the kind of chill that sinks into a child's tiny body far too quickly. Clara's eyes grew heavy. Her small voice whispered home in a way that made Milo's tail flick. But he didn't move. He wouldn't leave her to search for home. He would stay and wait, because waiting with her was safer than wandering alone. Back at the edge of the woods, a command center was forming. Deputies marked out grid sections on a map. Volunteers were given whistles to blow every few minutes to signal their location, and someone brought in portable lights, illuminating the first stretch of trees. Sarah's tears fell silently as she held a baby blanket to her face, praying aloud, her voice cracking with every word. The sheriff tried to reassure her, telling her that kids Clara's age don't go far. But even he knew that in woods this dense, not far could still feel endless. Time crawled, each minute stretching like an hour. The sun fully set now, the temperature dropping further. The first fireflies flickered in the distance. Milo stayed calm, but his body stiffened as he heard something moving nearby. A rustle in the underbrush, a faint snap of a twig. He lifted his head, scanning, his instincts ready to defend if anything came too close. Clara stirred, her eyes half open, and softly mumbled his name, Miwo. The kind of mispronunciation only a toddler could make. He responded by gently nuzzling her hand, letting her feel him there, steady and strong. Nearby, a raccoon scurried past, and Milo let out a low, warning growl, just enough to make the animal scatter away. He turned back to Clara, licking her forehead softly, as if telling her she was safe. Meanwhile, the search teams had split, one group taking the North Trail, another the West Ridge, and a K-9 unit moved south. But none of them realized Clara had followed the butterfly east, deeper toward the old clearing that wasn't on most maps. The sheriff's radio crackled with updates. No signs yet. Moving further, someone said, and Mark's hands shook as he stared into the darkness, whispering please, God please, over and over. In the woods, Milo slowly began shifting, standing but staying low, nudging Clara gently. Trying to keep her from lying too flat on the cool ground, he knew she shouldn't sleep there. He circled her once, then lay next to her again, wrapping his body along hers like a shield. And as he settled, he tilted his head back and let out a single soft bark, not loud, not frantic, just enough to echo faintly, but no one close enough heard it. Clara's breathing slowed, her eyes fluttering. Milo licked her cheek again, refusing to let her drift into deep sleep, because something in him knew she needed to stay awake just a little longer. The moon began to rise, its pale light casting long shadows between the trees, and far in the distance, a flashlight beam flickered briefly. Searchers passing a trail Milo had crossed hours earlier. They were close, but still too far. Lara's parents were now begging the officers to bring in more help, more dogs, more lights, anything. She's so little, Sarah sobbed. She won't know what to do? The sheriff placed a firm hand on her shoulder and said, We'll find her. But his voice was heavy. He knew the hours were critical. Back in the woods, Clara whimpered again, clutching Milo's fur tighter. Milo shifted slightly, lifting his head toward the faint sound of human voices far off. His ears pricked. He could hear them now, faint but there. He leaned down and nudged Clara, coaxing her to make a sound, but she only mumbled, too tired, too weak. So Milo did what only he could do. He tilted his head, and this time barked louder. Just once. A single deep call that rolled through the trees like a drum. One of the search dogs in the distance stopped, ears up, pulling its handler toward the faint echo. Wait, the handler said, straining to listen. Did you hear that? Another dog. He radioed the team. Possible contact ahead. Moving east, Milo heard the reply. Faint static mixed with human voices. And stayed alert. He didn't move Clara, didn't leave her side. But his eyes stayed on the direction of the sound, and slowly, slowly, the voices grew clearer. The crunch of leaves grew louder. Clara stirred again. Tiny voice whispering Mama so faint it was almost silent. Milo licked her face again, encouraging her, gently pawing at the ground near her to keep her awake. Moments later, a faint beam of light flickered through the trees, distant but visible. Milo barked again, sharper this time. And that was enough for the search team to hear. There, I hear it. One volunteer shouted, adrenaline surging as they followed the sound. Milo stood now, his body blocking Clara protectively, but his tail wagged once, just once, in cautious relief. The sound of footsteps grew closer, the light brighter. Clara blinked at the glow approaching, her lips trembling as she whispered Milo's name. And Milo, sensing rescue at last, let out one more bark, this time strong, steady, echoing through the woods like a beacon. The search team broke into a run toward. The sound calling out, "We're coming, hold on." But even before they reached the clearing, even before the relief washed over everyone, Milo stayed firmly beside her, watching the light approach, waiting to make sure these humans were the ones who would bring her back home. The footsteps grew louder, the crunch of boots on dry leaves echoing between the tall trees. But Milo stayed perfectly still, his body tense but calm, standing protectively over Clara. The beam of flashlights flickered closer, weaving through branches, casting strange shadows across the clearing where the little girl lay. Clara blinked at the light, too weak to cry, but awake enough to stir. Her tiny fingers curled tighter into Milo's fur. A soft whimper escaping her lips as she pressed her cheek against his back. Milo lowered his head slightly, his eyes locked on the movement ahead. And as the figures finally emerged from the dark, he barked once, not out of fear, but as if to guide them the final few steps. "Over here," a voice shouted, breaking the silence of the woods. "I see her. There's a dog, too." The searchers rushed into the clearing, to volunteers kneeling quickly, their flashlights now steady on the small, pale child lying against the loyal dog Clara. One whispered softly, "Careful not to startle her, sweetie. We're here." "You're safe now." But Clara didn't answer, her eyes half closed, her lips pale from the cold. Milo turned his head, watching them carefully, his body stiff for a moment, as if silently asking, "Are you sure you can take care of her now?" One of the rescuers reached out slowly, speaking in a low, calming voice. "Good boy, it's okay. We're here to help." And Milo, after one last glance at Clara, stepped slightly aside, but stayed close. Watching every move, one of the men scooped Clara gently into his arms, wrapping her in a thick emergency blanket. "She's cold," he said urgently into his radio. "We've got her, but we need medics ready at the trailhead." Clara's small head lolled against the man's chest, and for the first time she whispered one soft word, "Milo." Her eyes fluttered shut again. Milo followed as they began moving, his steps close and steady, his eyes never leaving Clara. Back near the entrance of the woods, Sarah stood frozen, gripping Mark's arm so tightly her knuckles were white, and when she saw the glow of multiple flashlights approaching, her heart pounded in her chest. "Please let it be her," she whispered over and over. Mark's face was pale, his eyes locked on the tree line, unable to blink, and then, as the rescuers stepped into view, carrying a tiny bundle wrapped in a silver blanket, Sarah let out a cry so raw it echoed through the quiet night. She ran forward, falling to her knees before the rescuer, her shaking hands reaching out. "Clara, oh my baby," she sobbed, touching her daughter's cold cheeks, kissing her forehead through her tears. Clara stirred faintly, whispering again. Milo and Sarah's tear-filled eyes turned to the dog, who stood just behind the rescuers, tail wagging gently but cautiously, his eyes still focused on Clara. "He stayed with her?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. The rescuer nodded. "He never left her side. He kept her warm. He even barked to lead us here." Sarah reached out and touched Milo's head, her fingers shaking. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved my baby." Medics rushed forward then, checking Clara's breathing, wrapping her in more blankets, giving her warm fluids, and as they prepared to take her to the ambulance, Milo tried to step closer, but was gently held back for a moment. One medic looked at the family and asked, "Is he yours?" Mark nodded, his voice breaking. "Yes, he's ours. He's her best friend." The medic smiled faintly. "Then he can come too. He's earned it." Milo jumped into the ambulance behind Clara, curling at her feet as they gently laid her on a stretcher. Sarah climbed in after, never letting go of her daughter's hand, and Mark followed, his face finally breaking into silent tears of relief. As the ambulance doors closed, Milo pressed his head against Clara's tiny legs, his presence calm and grounding. During the ride, Clara opened her eyes just enough to see him and whispered something no one else could quite hear, but it made his ears twitch and his tail thump softly against the stretcher. Back at the house, the neighbors who had joined the search gathered on the porch, waiting anxiously for news, and when the sheriff returned with an update, telling them Clara was safe and being treated, a collective sigh of relief swept through them all. But the story didn't end there, because the doctors would later say that the hours in the cold could have been far more dangerous if Milo hadn't kept her warm. His body heat had prevented her from hypothermia. His constant nudging and licking had kept her awake enough to avoid slipping into deeper exhaustion. And his barks had been the only reason the search team found her before the night grew even. Colder in the hospital that night, as Clara slept under warm blankets, Milo lay curled beside her bed, his head resting on her tiny hand. And Sarah sat nearby, watching the two of them with tears in her eyes. "He's not just a dog," she whispered to Mark, who nodded. No, he's family. And tonight, he was her guardian over the next few days. News of Milo's loyalty spread through the small town. Neighbors brought treats and toys for him. People stopped Sarah at the grocery store to say how incredible it was, and the local newspaper even ran a story titled "The Dog Who Saved Clara." But for Sarah and Mark, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about the quiet moments in the hospital room, watching Clara slowly regain her strength, and seeing Milo never leave her side. Not for meals, not for walks, not even when nurses came in, he stayed, always between her and the door, as if he knew she still needed him. And every time Clara stirred, her little hand instinctively reached for him, and he was always there, waiting. The morning sun filtered softly through the hospital blinds, casting pale golden stripes across the quiet room where Clara slept, her tiny chest rising and falling with slow but steady breaths. Sarah sat in the chair beside her, fingers lightly tracing her daughter's cheek, as if still afraid she might disappear. And at the foot of the bed, Milo lay curled like a living shield, his fur slightly damp from the dew of the forest, but his eyes calm now. Watchful but at peace, Mark walked in with 2 cups of coffee, his eyes tired but softer than they had been. In daze, he handed one to Sarah and whispered, "She's stable now. The doctors say she'll be just fine." Sarah nodded, her lips trembling into a smile that carried both relief and gratitude. "Because of him," she said, looking at Milo. The dog shifted his head at the sound of her voice but didn't move from his post. Clara stirred gently, her eyelids fluttering open to reveal the soft blue of her eyes. She looked around for a moment, disoriented, and then whispered one small word, "Milo." The dog's ears perked, and he stood slowly, stepping closer until his nose touched her tiny hand. Clara smiled faintly, her fingers curling into his fur. "You stayed with me?" she whispered, and though he didn't understand the words, Milo licked her hand gently as if to say, "I'll always stay." The nurse entered quietly, smiling at the sight. "It's rare," she said softly to Sarah and Mark, "for a child to be this calm after something so scary. I think it's because she knows she was never really alone." Over the next few days, Clara grew stronger. Her cheeks regained their rosy color, and each time doctors came in to check her, Milo would lift his head, but never leave her side. The hospital staff grew attached to him too, bringing him little bowls of water and even sneaking him bits of chicken from the cafeteria. One evening, as Sarah brushed Clara's hair, Mark sat down beside Milo, his hand resting gently on the dog's back. "You saved her," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You didn't just keep her warm. You gave her the courage to wait for us." Milo rested his head on Mark's lap, his eyes half closing but still aware, as if he knew the weight of those words. When Clara was finally discharged, the hospital hallway filled with smiles and soft goodbyes. Nurses bent down to pet Milo. "Take care of her, hero," one whispered. And Clara, in Sarah's arms, waved sleepily, "Bye-bye," but Milo walked beside her, his steps steady and proud. Back home, the atmosphere felt different, warmer, more alive. Neighbors gathered on the porch with balloons and little gifts for Clara. But what made everyone pause was when Clara stepped into the living room and pointed to Milo, saying in her tiny voice, "My best friend." The room fell silent for a moment, then someone softly clapped, and soon everyone was cheering. But Milo just wagged his tail gently, as if shy about the attention. The next day, the local newspaper sent a reporter to write about the rescue. The headline read, "Loyal Family Dog Saves Toddler in Woods," and the photo captured Clara sitting on the couch with Milo beside her, his head resting on her lap. But the story didn't stop there. A few days later, the sheriff arrived at their door with something unexpected. In his hands was a small medal with a blue ribbon for bravery and loyalty, he said, as he crouched to gently place it around Milo's neck. Clara clapped her tiny hands and giggled. "Milo's a hero!" she exclaimed. Milo tilted his head, confused but happy. Sarah had tears in her eyes. "He doesn't need a medal, but thank you," she said softly. The sheriff smiled. "Maybe he doesn't, but the rest of the town should know what he did." As weeks passed, Life slowly returned to normal, but something had changed in the hearts of the family. Clara no longer feared sleeping alone because Milo was always right outside her door. Sarah found herself spending more quiet moments watching the two of them play, realizing how deep the bond had become, and Mark started volunteering for the town's search and rescue team, inspired by what Milo had shown them all one evening. As the sun set over the backyard, Clara sat on the porch steps holding a small book. She looked up at Milo and said, "Want to hear a story?" And even though he didn't understand, he lay down beside her, his head resting on her little knee. Sarah stood by the window, watching, and whispered to Mark, "They saved each other, didn't they?" Mark nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Yes, and I think they always will," months later. The town hosted a small community gathering in the park. People brought their dogs, children played on the grass, and Clara, wearing a bright yellow dress, held Milo's leash proudly as they walked together to the stage. The mayor spoke briefly, sharing the story of the night Milo saved Clara. "This is a reminder," he said, "that sometimes the purest form of love doesn't need words, it just needs presence." The crowd applauded as Milo was given a special honorary certificate. But for Clara, none of that mattered. She simply knelt down, wrapped her tiny arms around his neck, and whispered, "I love you." Milo licked her cheek softly, his tail wagging slowly, because to him, the only reward he needed was her smile. That night, as the family sat together under the stars, Clara leaned against Sarah and asked, "Mama, why did Milo stay with me?" Sarah kissed her forehead and said, "Because that's what love does. It stays, even when it's hard." And Milo, lying close, let out a soft, content sigh. The house felt warmer, fuller, safer, because everyone knew one simple truth: Clara would never be alone as long as Milo was there. And sometimes, that was all anyone really needed. If you've ever felt that your dog understands you in ways no one else can, then you know exactly what this story means. Would your dog stay by your side too? Share your thoughts in the comments, and remember, the love of a dog can change everything.